All right, this video we're going to visit the topic of opera. This won't be an exhaustive discovery of opera. It's just the basics and the introduction, so you can sound kind of smart if you ever get into an opera situation in your life. And so, just like last time, I want to go over a couple of vocabulary words, or our last video, I want to go over a couple of vocabulary words to just kind of get us in the same idea. There's only three. Aria, which is a solo voice piece in an opera with a strong melody line, and then a recitative, a style of singing that closely approximates speech. Recitatives usually has little orchestral accompaniment. And then finally, the libretto, which is the text of an opera. So let's just very quickly talk about how an opera is structured. I'm sure we all have an idea of what an opera is. Right, so we'll take some of those preconceived notions and we'll put in some real definitions and structure and see how they line up, and you can let me know if that matched or not. Every opera begins with an overture, and that is basically a piece of music that goes through all of the themes and motifs that will be introduced into the opera itself. It's played with no actors and focuses purely on the music. It's kind of like a trailer for a movie, but you don't watch it before the opera. You just watch it like on TV. You don't see it in an ad or a YouTube ad. You'll see it and hear it as you're waiting for the opera to start. And then when the curtains come up, the opera itself is a large work and it tells a dramatic story that is typically secular, which means not based on religious texts. And at its core, an opera is musical. It uses vocalists, both soloists and ensembles, and an ensemble is a large group of people. And they're accompanied by an orchestra. And sometimes those are big, sometimes those are small. Those are basically all the instrumentalists. An opera is the dialogue between actors or a narrator to the audience, or the inner dialogue of a character is usually most often sung. There's typically no talking in opera, or if there is, it's very little and it's not the focus. It's all about the music. And as I have alluded to and mentioned multiple times, it is first and foremost a musical work. There is a story that is being told, and the story is important, and that drives the music and it drives the singing. Uh, and the composer who writes all of the music isn't the person who writes the story itself. That story that the composer is writing music to can come from a number of different areas. It can be an already written work, like a story or a poem. It could be somebody who writes a brand new story. It could be somebody who plays off of old stories and reimagines that. That happens a lot. Like Romeo and Juliet is a story that's told over and over and over and over again in operas and plays and musicals and movies, right? That same format. So it's just a reimagination of it. Uh, but whatever the words, or however those words get to the composer, that written part is called the libretto. So the libretto is the story, the actual text to the opera. Unfortunately for the librettist, or the person who writes that libretto, the musician and really the composer is the one who gets famous. So you could have the best story in the whole world, and if that doesn't translate well to music, or music isn't put onto it well, it won't become famous. Opera is a musical work telling a story. So, in order to tell the story, you have to have vocalists who can sing, in opera specifically. Seems pretty obvious, right? In order to advance the story forward and to show off the talent of the singers, we divide operas into two main styles of songs, singing parts. So we had the overture, which we already talked about at the beginning, that introduces all the themes and motifs. And then inside the opera itself, we have two different types of songs. The first style, and the one that really is the one to show off the vocalist's ability to sing, is called an aria. Arias are songs typically sung by a single character, and like I said in the last sentence, it's just meant to show the talent of the singer. It also helps to give insight to the character, or to tell a little bit of the background of the character. Sometimes it might be inner thoughts, it might be like a frozen in time moment. And they're important to the development of the character and the ability to show that that person can sing, but it doesn't actually really move the story forward very much. So these are like moments of depth. So if you're looking at a story, it goes from left to right, or right to left, depending on which way the video flips. The story is linear. and it goes across, and you have a beginning and a middle and an end. And that's good, and you can be very surface level. Arias allow us to go deep. So we take a moment in time, and then we understand the depth of the character. And it's really a chance for character and musical development. On the flip side, there is called a recitative. It's one of my favorite musical words to say in probably all the music, recitative. And the way that it's pronounced gives an indication of the style of music you'll be hearing when listening to a recitative. It's very short and choppy in the sense that there aren't necessarily, the song's not there necessarily to show off the beauty of the voice. The recitative's purpose is to move the story along. So where arias are vertical, we get great insight into a character. It's frozen in a moment of time. Recitatives move that story along the timeline. Sometimes it's between singing and talking. Basically, it's the exact opposite of an aria. The other important thing about a recitative that's different than an aria is recitatives will often involve multiple characters. Aria is one character, most likely, and recitatives are multiple characters. Now, any of the voice parts can sing these, and there are four main voice types. So, soprano and alto are typically female voices. Soprano is high, alto is middle. Then there's two male-based voices, which are tenor and bass. Tenor is higher male, bass is the lowest voice. Everything else is a derivative of those voice types. And I say it's male or female typically because that's who falls into that range. But when you start getting to that middle section between soprano, or between alto and tenor, you start to get guys who can sing alto and girls who can sing tenor. So there are distinct ranges for those notes. The highest soprano, though, so if we're deriving ourselves off of these other voice types, the highest soprano is called a coloratura soprano. And these are the highest singers. They make a lot of money because they can sing very high and can sing very beautifully. Then there's what's called a mezzo soprano. This is the space in between a soprano and an alto, a medium soprano. And then there is a spot between a tenor and a bass, so the two low voices there, and that's called a baritone. I'm naturally a baritone, right, which means I can't go very low as a bass, or I can't go as low as a bass, and I can't go as high as a typical tenor. So I sit somewhere right in the middle. My comfortable singing range is that of a baritone. There's also one more voice which is really coveted, and that is a male with a very high voice called a contratenor. This is a male that can sing very, very, very high, up into the soprano range, and most often in the olden days, that was achieved by manipulation of a body at a very young age, so your voice never changes. So the opera's beginnings is from this group called the Florentine Camerata, which is a group of artists, musicians, poets, and intellectuals whose meetings led to a birth of opera at the beginning of the 17th century. That's who this core group is. And the cool thing is this group of artists and musicians and poets and scholars and all these people, they weren't the first people to think of something like this. It's really a throwback to the ancient Greeks who would get together, they would recite poetry, and they would combine that with singing and stage acting. Sounds kind of like a musical or an opera. Their idea was to bring all these art forms together into one presentation. And so the Florentine Camerata believed the same thing, and so they did this, and opera was born. Out of that comes this guy named Claudio Monteverdi, who is the one who really refined and perfected the early opera art form. He's not the only person that wrote opera, but he certainly is kind of a father to this art form. And unlike the ancient Greek style of whatever they were doing, opera has stuck around even to this day, right? I mean, there are operas being performed today. I know where I live, you can go to the movie theater on certain days and watch a performance of the opera piped in from New York at the Met. So, with most artists, or as with most artists, inspiration doesn't come from one area of life. While the Greeks inspired a large portion of this art form, the Florentine Camerata wasn't just inspired by the Greeks. They also got ideas from the intermedi, which is music that was performed in between acts of a play. So stage productions and plays were still a very real thing, and they had breaks. So in those breaks, they'd have a musical act. And these little acts would feature myths and other themes that really had nothing at all to do with the play that was being currently being presented. So you had the influence of the Greeks bringing all these art forms together. You had the influence of these musical acts that dealt with mythology and other serious random topics in between acts of a play. You put all of that together and you get opera. So opera starts in Italy, but it doesn't stay there. Very quickly it goes to France, and then from there it goes kind of out to the rest of the world. Different styles of opera are developed in different countries. And so in this next short section, I'm going to cover some of the classical or classic styles of opera. There is the ballad opera, which is a type of 18th century English opera that has speaking roles instead of recitatives. So instead of those singing parts where they're short in between multiple characters, they'll put some actual spoken dialogue in there. Their themes are usually comic, uh, comedic, and political in nature. Then we have the Commedia dell'arte, which is an Italian improvisational comedy of 16th and 17th centuries. The opera buffa, which is an Italian comic opera of the 18th century. And I should say, when we say comic, that doesn't necessarily mean funny. It's just a style of storytelling. Then there's opera syria, or serious or tragic opera of the 18th and early 19th centuries, most commonly using text by the librettist Metastasio. The arias and recitatives alternate in predictable ways, which means you have an aria, then you're going to have a recitative, then you're going to have an aria and a recitative. So it goes back and forth pretty commonly. We have the Zingspiel, which is an 18th century German opera. This also has speaking roles instead of recitatives. These themes usually involve fantasy or the tension between good and evil. And it's kind of cool. A lot of German music that I've personally sung usually deals kind of in this fantasy realm and this tension of good and evil, which is pretty cool. It's interesting how different countries have different flavors of storytelling. And then after the first initial burst of opera, this French opera that we said, goes from Italy to France is the Tragédie Lyrique. And sorry for my French, all you French speakers. And this is 17th century French opera in 5 acts. This is also, just like the Zingspiel, but before it, has to do with mythological themes. So there are other opera styles being developed today, and a lot of talented composers still writing in this style. I just recently watched an opera that told the story of Moby Dick, right? So that's an example of a story that was already written that was interpreted as an opera and still being developed. There are old operas being reimagined with people wearing current clothes versus like the old clothes back in the day. There's an opera about President Nixon in China, So I want to give you those 3 opera composers in the early 1900s in America. And this is an influential time because American music is really known. Our contribution, because as an American, is like jazz and country music, and jazz was really our first contribution of new music to the world. But we we got opera. I mean, society brought opera over with them. And so there's 3 composers I want to mention specifically. And what makes them unique even more so is it's 3 black composers. And black composers is a group that is generally not recognized in the study very frequently of Western art music. And I'm putting these here intentionally because if you just go to Google famous opera composers, right, it's going to be basically all European white dudes. Okay, so I want to give you 3 names. The first is Scott Joplin, and you know Scott Joplin probably from he's a piano player, a jazz ragtime player. Maple Leaf Rag is one, or the Entertainer. He wrote an opera in 1911 called Tremonisha. And then there's H. Lawrence Freeman, an opera called Voodoo in 1914. And Shirley Graham Du Bois writes Tom Tom in 1932. And Shirley Graham Du Bois is cool because this is from the New York Times, an article I'll link down below. It's called Perhaps the First Black Woman to Have an Opera Performed in 1932 is when that opera came out. So check out, broaden your horizons a little bit. I'm asking you to stretch out and watch some opera, but then stretch even further to watch some cool opera. It doesn't have to be old, it doesn't have to be stuffy, and it doesn't have to be made by old white dudes. But give it a listen. Let me know what you think and enjoy some opera.